Yesterday, I took the long way home, worlds away from the noise I know. It never felt so good to be alone. Summer haze burning through my soul, dusty lane mid the field of gold, and poppies growing all along the road. The pictures in the sky seem to wave goodbye to what's behind me, and questions why begin to die as evening finds me following the stars.
Anyway, it's good to have you with us, Bill. There's another item about Bill you should know a couple. One is that he's in the direct descendant line of Andrew Pickens, and he, I guess I've got this right, directly from the brother of Colonel Pickens. And so also he has some Cherokee DNA going for him. And so that makes a nice historic setting for you, Bill. And so we're glad to have you. Glad to have you in the community for, well, he's been around here for a day or so, and we'll be back. But also he has some copies of his new book, Pickens, Andrew Pickens. I think I'd have to say, Skeet, maybe you could, somebody else could do a little critique on this, but it seems to me that it's probably the best item going right now. I mean, I am not any kind of an authority, but I know a little bit about this, and it's needed, and I'm glad we've got it. So go ahead.
Well, thank you. For about 4 hours or so, at least. But I want to thank the Rotary Club and the Kettle Creek Battlefield Association for their parts in setting this up. It's very generous of you to do so. And I especially wanted to thank Walker for acting as the point of contact for me on this. The book, Andrew Pickens, is a microcosm of his life, and Joseph Pickens, who's my ancestor. There used to be some biographies on Andrew Pickens, but they've been out of print for a long time. One was written by a descendant of his, Dr. A.L. Pickens, in the early 1900s. And it was a good book. They're hard to find. I've got a copy of that one. But there were some other good ones. His peers, Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter, they were all three brigadier generals in the South Carolina State Militia late in the war. And you can go to any bookstore or library and find biographies of the other two in Henry Lee, but you don't find one that's current on Andrew Pickens. So I thought, gee, that's a shame. And my wife said, well, you've been studying it, so write one. Okay. And that's what we did. It's also a macrocosm on the Southern theater. There are periods where Andrew Pickens was inactive, like when he was on parole after the fall of Charlestown. And I needed to keep the flow going to let you know what's going on around him when you read the book, what he's having to put up with and so forth. So I followed the war in the South and talked about other battles other than the ones he was involved in also. And it was very interesting for me. Now, as Joe said, he's my 7th grade grand uncle, actually, is what it amounts to. Joseph Pickens was my 7th grade grandfather. You can probably see the resemblance. Now you can see the resemblance. Not good either. Okay. All right. Well, I also want to give some thanks to other historians, especially people like Dr. Christine Swagger. I don't know if I pronounce her name right, but I've got a copy of her book, Heroes of Kettle Creek. And also Robert Scott Davis, the Battle of Canebrake that he had in this past Kettle Creek Battlefield Association dispatch was great. And when you write a book like this, you look at other reference material and you pull out of it what you can, and you attempt to put together what makes sense. Different people are writing different parts of it, and I had a particular thing I wanted here, so I take the best of what I can, look at it, and weigh it all, and make the best decision I can. If we looked at the Battle of Kettle Creek, for instance, and I won't spend a lot of time on that because I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, I think, on the Battle of Kettle Creek. But
I don't think so. You go ahead.
Andrew Pickens' focus was to help Colonel Dooley and Lieutenant Colonel Clark get back into Georgia. They had been run out by Hamilton, who, after the fall of Savannah, had come over to this neck of the woods and forced them out. And the militias they had were very good militias, but they weren't real large at the time. So they were in South Carolina and pleaded for the South Carolina to help them get back in. The governor of South Carolina told Major Andrew Williamson to have Andrew Pickens do that. So Andrew Pickens was mustering his militia, and Joseph hung back up in the area around 96 and Long Canes, mustering more militia while Andrew came on down and met with Dooley and Clark. And they came back over to the Georgia side, and they were primarily at that time focused on the British fellow John Hamilton, who was a major. And he's the one that was forcing the Georgia militia into problems, and they were harassing the settlers in the backcountry, forcing them to sign statements that they would be loyal to the crown and so forth and so on. So they had chased him around a little bit and had him pretty well trapped at Carr's Fort, which you noticed in this last dispatch they have located, and that'll be great as they progress with that. But at that time, while Joseph Pickens was up in 96, he heard about Boyd coming down with a whole bunch of Tories that he had gathered up around the North Carolina-South Carolina border, and were headed south, but he thought they were going to tarry around the Independence up there by Long Canes and cause a lot of trouble. So he sent word down to Andrew Pickens about that, and Andrew and the militias all of a sudden left Carr's Fort and were headed back up into South Carolina. And then Joseph sent another message saying that Boyd was on his way down. So at that point then, Joseph Pickens came down too and joined him along with what he had mustered. Between the South Carolina militia and the Georgia militias, they had about 350 people. About 200 of them were South Carolinians and the rest of them were Georgians. So Dooley and Pickens made an agreement that Pickens would take command since he had a larger militia. And they hadn't been as scattered as Georgia had at the time. And it worked pretty well, and they seemed to really get along well. They did a lot of work together in future years. So Joseph Pickens was assigned to accompany Captain Robert Anderson along the Savannah River to look for and watch for Boyd and his group. Now, Joseph Pickens wasn't in Anderson's company, but he was familiar with Boyd and what they were looking for, so he rode with them to do that. And that of course, led to this Battle of Kettle Creek. They eventually found Boyd and started tailing him. Now, the interesting thing about this is you've got the Patriot militia, who are crackerjack troops. I know Pickens and his militia had practiced weekly. When they weren't mustered, they practiced weekly. And it wasn't Continental Army drilling. you know, where they march and all that stuff. They were practicing mounting, dismounting, working with their sabers and firing their gun, and how to signal each other when things were changing in a battle. For instance, they might start dismounting, firing their gun, and then all of a sudden want to charge with a saber, and you couldn't hear and you couldn't, you'd have a hard time even seeing with the dust and smoke. So they were crackerjack troops. Now, the fellows that Boyd had gathered, the backcountry Tories, were criminals, basically. There was three or four different types.
Didn't say Irish.
There were three different types of Tories. There were some that were really political, you know. And this was represented by, I'd say, some of the estate owners along the coast and in the middle country who had imports to England. They had an interest in promoting a good relationship between the colonies and England for their imports. So that was a philosophical thing. Well, you also had another group of Tories who wavered back and forth depending on how things were going and where they thought they should be. If it looked like one side was winning and the other one not, it changed. Well, they would change too. But you also had some of these guys in the backcountry. That's what most of the Tories in the backcountry were, who were there because the British Army could not enforce laws in the backcountry. They didn't have the manpower. And so they kind of had their way, and the Tories outnumbered the Patriots about 2 to 1 in the backcountry. So it was quite a dire situation, and that's why the Patriots in the backcountry were so determined to put together a good militia. Now, Andrew Pickens himself was a Scots-Irish Presbyterian, and he was a very extremely honorable man, and he was also very quiet. He was not jocular. I don't think it's ever recorded that he laughed, and he was very stern and serious. But he did make one attempt at humor once, and I want to read that to you. And I say attempt. I didn't say it was humorous. If I can find it here. Yeah. Okay, this was after Kruger had left 96. Pickens and his brigade were following at some considerable distance, and Kruger was being followed by civilian Tory families and so forth as they headed south and east. And it says, Pickens' brigade followed and considered some action against Kruger's force, but the militiamen and their horses were too exhausted from recent actions to harass local loyalists and obtain intelligence to be forwarded to General Greene. The militia finally stopped on a hilltop and watched as Kruger's force marched away. Brigadier General Andrew Pickens, in a rare attempt at humor, later stated, "We were on horses so exhausted by service that they could neither get up with the enemy nor get away from him."